let me ask you guys this question. How many of you guys have seen signs before? You've seen road signs and stuff like that? You guys seen that stuff? I had a couple signs here that maybe you're familiar with and signs that you've seen before. You guys have seen this. If you have any kids that are learning how to drive, right, these are really important that you're teaching them, right? And I got a couple signs here. You guys have seen these before. You probably saw a couple on the way into work. And then I actually found, as I was looking looking through these signs, I actually found my favorite traffic sign. I don't know if you guys know that, but I didn't think I could have a favorite traffic sign, but I do have a favorite traffic sign now. So here's my favorite traffic sign. Did anybody take a guess at what that? So this is in. I'm not going to explain it because hopefully you guys figured it out. But this is in Germany because apparently they have problems with people doing that somewhere near the roads on the woods, right? So I just thought it was kind of funny and interesting. But you know what all those signs that we just talked about have in common? Signs, they all have this in common because this is the purpose of signs. Signs are meant to direct you. They're meant to direct you. They're meant specifically to keep you on the right path and keep you from going and making a wrong turn or going and doing something you ought not to, like in the last sign, or maybe trying to keep you on the correct path, right? That's the purpose of signs. They are simply meant to direct you. They point you, is what I say sometimes. They point you to something, right? That's the point. They point you and direct you towards something. Have you ever been in a place that doesn't have signs? How many of you guys ever gone to an airport that doesn't have good signage? You've gone there and it's just hard to find your way, right? I come from a really small town in Ohio, and I didn't notice this until I came from like D.C. area when I started living there. But we don't have a lot of those signs to help guide and direct. A lot of the signs that we have is like one sign, and it's like, here's the highway, and then if you don't turn at the right spot, you are never going to figure out how to get back on that highway. You're just done. You're never going back on the highway again. You missed it. You're never going back because it's just a small town, and it's so frustrating for people who aren't from that area just because they just doesn't have good signs. Because without signs, I mean, if you didn't have your phone and you were driving and you didn't have, your phone, that Siri and all that to tell you where to go, you would be lost without signs on the road, right? Because signs direct you. They point you to something. And let's be honest, the first time you walked in the building and you looked for the restroom, what did you look for? Sign on the wall, right? You were looking for a sign because they direct you. More on that in just a moment. We're starting a brand new series I talked about titled Miracles. Miracles. Now, this series is going to be a lot of fun, and I'm excited for it because we're actually going to be walking through the stories or the miracles that John records in his gospel. So earlier this year, we looked at Luke, and we looked specifically at things that happened more than miracles. But here we want to look at these miracles. And here's some things about the book of John or the gospel of John that you may not know. That John, he actually only recorded 7 signs. And he actually doesn't call them miracles at all. He calls them signs. And he recorded specifically 7. Now, we know Jesus did many, many more than 7. But he says, you know what? These 7 are important. These 7 are significant. And here's something else you might not know about the Gospel of John. It's actually divided right in half. So if you go near John 11, right after the raising of Lazarus, after that whole rest of those chapters until you get to the end is the last week of the life of Jesus, called the Passion Week in the city of Jerusalem. He doesn't do what the other gospel writers do, where it's like spans his earthly ministry over the course of the book and then kind of have the resurrection and all that at the end. John focuses in on the last half for over half of his book. The other half of the book is he kind of is blazing a path forward, again, all pointing to Jesus being the king, Jesus being the Messiah. And as he's doing that, he's putting those specific signs in. They're almost like waypoints that we hit along the way until we get past Lazarus, the last miracle, the last major miracle and sign, and then we go into the Passion Week. So John even talks about it. He talks about all of these signs and wonders at the last moment. And in the last chapter of his book, of his writing, he says, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that could be written. Which begs the question, hold on, John. Why did you pick those 7? Because, Matthew picked some, Mark picked some, Luke picked some. They talked about it in Acts. The Apostle Paul refers to a few. Why did you pick 7? And you got to remember something about John's book. When John's writing, he's writing as an old man. He's not writing is right after the events happened. So you got to think, he survived all of his friends. Most of his friends are dead by now. And he's exiled on the island of Patmos. And he's sitting there. And I believe that his followers, because, he was an apostle, so he had followers. They all took on the rabbinic model that Jesus had, like disciples, because he says, go make disciples, right? So he's got these disciples that he's teaching them about Jesus. And you got to think, imagine if you had somebody who walked with Christ, but hadn't written anything down. That's what they're looking at. So all the followers of John are looking and going, hey, you spent time with Jesus. You need to write down your experiences with Jesus. And I think John for a long time, because they probably said that many different times. John for a little bit's like, oh, I'm not going to write it down. Like, it's not a big deal, whatever, blah, 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 blah. And then finally I think he caves and he goes, okay, fine. I will begin to record my account of what I experienced with Jesus. And if you notice, John reads and feels different and focuses on different things than the rest of the Gospels focus on. Did you notice that when you read through John? It's different. And it's different because John already knew that those other 3 had been written. So he looks and he goes, all those are fantastic and all those are wonderful, and they all kind of read like historical accounts, and it's, Mark is very much like, and then Jesus did this, and it's like wave tops of his ministry. And then Luke is thoroughly investigating, so he goes into excruciating detail in some places, and in other places Luke decides it's not important, so he doesn't spend a lot of time there. And then Matthew spends time kind of pointing it back to Jesus from a Jewish background. And so John gets a hold of it, and he says, I'm going to tell the story from an angle that nobody else got to see. I'm going to tell a story about not just what he did, but I want to tell a story about who he was. And if you read the book of John from cover to cover, you'll find out that he's talking a lot about the person of Jesus. He's making it about the person of Jesus. He's pointing to his deity. He's pointing to his power. He's pointing to all those things. But he wants you and me to know that he's not just, and then Jesus did this miracle, and then Jesus did this miracle. It's a behind the scenes, what he saw, what he experienced with Christ, which is why you get moments where he comes in, explains what happens, and then he kind of goes into his own little section of an explanation. We didn't know this, but then this happened. We didn't know this, but this is how it rolled out. So that's what you see when you get the Gospel of John. So we're going to spend the next few weeks as we go into this series. We're going to look at all of the miracles that John records, and we're going to ask the question, why? What sign, what are you pointing to, John? Why is it that you picked these signs to record in your gospel? Because you just told us that there was so many more that could have been picked, but yet you picked these 7. So we're going to spend the next few weeks doing just that. So if you have your Bibles, we're going to start week 1 with John chapter 2, starting in verse 1. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and flip there, and then I'm going to bring us up to speed on what we're doing, or what he's been doing up to this point. So Jesus, up to this point, has been, John, as he opens his book, he's trying to find, he's trying to find what exactly, and how do I start this? Because I'm trying to figure out how do I understand and talk about Jesus, but I don't know how. And that's why you get that poem that opens John chapter 1. Because it's almost like he's sitting there going, I don't know how to start this. I don't know how to record and begin what I saw and who I saw and who I spent time with. I don't really have the words for it, which is why John opens his gospel with, in the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was with God. And when he does that, he's putting a poem in there so that we can kind of grasp, because he really didn't, I think he struggled. I think he sat on it and looked at a blank piece of paper for a while before it came to him as how he needed to describe Jesus. And so he goes on, he describes Jesus in the opening of John chapter 1. Then after that, John testifies, not John the author, right? There's John the baptizer. John the baptizer, he testifies about Jesus and says, Jesus is coming, he's going to be amazing. I am not worthy to untie his sandals. And then Jesus shows up and he gets baptized, and we see the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit all present at one moment at the baptism of Christ. And then after that, Jesus calls his disciples into the ministry. And he goes around and he does some miracles there. I mean, we have records of the way he got Peter in was he showed Peter he could get him a bunch of fish, right? I mean, we saw those. So he's done miracles before, but he hadn't done them publicly at all. And he didn't want anybody to know just yet. He wasn't ready for all that. And so John records the first miracle, or to use his word, the first sign. So, John chapter 2, verse 1 says this. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. Now, in Jewish culture, weddings aren't what we think of today. When we think of weddings, we think show up and, you show up at 3 o'clock, do a little bit of rehearsal, and then you're not allowed to see the bride, and the bride comes down, and that ceremony maybe lasts an hour, you know what I'm talking about? And then, I do, yep, and then you go to the reception afterwards, and then once you're at the reception, you hang out, you have a good time, you drink grape juice and all sorts of other things, and eat, and then after that, around 7, 8 o'clock, it's done, right? Like after that's kind of done, like, cool, we're done. Not in the first century. In the first century, a wedding was a multi-day event, okay? And it was a multi-day event because they basically spanned what we consider the reception as part of the ceremony over the course of multiple days, okay? Which is why it's so significant that the next thing we're going to read about the wine is so significant, because they partied the whole time in the wedding. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like it's pretty fun. That sounds like it's way cooler than what we do where it's just a little bit, but I would love to sit and feast and celebrate somebody, and that's what they're doing. Because remember, in the Jewish culture that they thought about, it was a joining of lives. And in their viewpoint also, it was almost a joining of spirit. And Jesus even said, when the two have become one. So that's what they're celebrating this amazing moment. And so it's catastrophic what happens next. So Mary, the mother of Jesus, she's there. Jesus is there with his disciples. And when the wine was gone, somebody say, oh no. That's right, oh no. The wine was gone. Jesus' mother said to him, they have no more wine. But she was probably part of the party planning committee, likely she had some influence there. Because she looks at Jesus and she goes to him and she goes, they have no more wine. Now, depending on your background, you're even uncomfortable us talking about wine in church, okay? I don't know what background you came from, but for some of us, you weren't allowed to talk about it. This is one of those miracles that didn't happen, depending on your tradition, right? You didn't talk about it. You weren't allowed to talk about it. Jesus turned water into grape juice, and we didn't talk about it. We didn't have felt grass. It wasn't any of those things. But we're going to find that he did, and he did it for a very specific purpose, and it's not just because Jesus likes to party, okay? There's a different reason that he did it. There's a different reason, and it focuses in on who he was. But Jesus, coming in, Mary looks at him and goes, they have no more wine. And now it's very troublesome to run out of wine in the first century because that would have been dishonoring. Remember, you got a multi-day event, and all of a sudden you ran out of wine, which was a key part of the drink that they had. And when you hear wine, I don't want you to think about the wine that you drink, okay? It's not like 5, 6, 7% alcohol. Okay, this is a lot lower percentage alcohol wine, but again, if you drink it all the time, you're going to be feeling it. But the point is that this is part of their culture, part of their ceremony, part of their celebration. And it's gone. Very dishonoring, very disrespectful. And these may even be people related to Jesus. We don't actually know what wedding it is. And so Mary comes to him and she goes, honey, they're out of wine. And again, there's an old Jewish proverb that talks about the importance of it. This old Jewish proverb says, without wine, there is no joy. And the church said, hey, see? I knew the 11 would do that. 9 o'clock doesn't do that. They're here early. But this is the worldview that they have. This is why it's so important. This is why Mary even bothers. Have you ever wondered about that? Why would Mary bother Jesus with this concern? This seems so human, so unnecessary. Nobody's hurt, nobody's dying, like they ran out of wine. So what? Go to the ABC store. Like, who cares? That's what I always thought. I was like, why on earth would Mary bother Jesus with this? Until you understand that it was part of the culture, and until you really grasp that this was the way they celebrated. And I think Jesus kind of figures out, he looks around, and I think he figures out, he goes, I know how I'm going to do this. I know what I'm going to do now. It's not just going to be a party, guys. We're going to actually do something a little bit different. But first, Jesus has the response that many of us would have. Like, many of us would feel this way. He says, woman. Now, since we got all the kids in the auditorium, look up here. Do not look at your mother and say, woman, okay? Right? And all the women said, yeah, don't do that. Don't do that and say, well, Jesus did it. No, because I know as soon as I teach this, some of the teenagers are going to go home and go, woman, and then I'm not going to help you, and neither is the Lord when your father comes out of the recliner, okay? You're on your own, spare the rod, spoil the child, right? So not doing that. But so what we really miss, and we hear this, is it's more like Jesus saying, my lady. It's more like Jesus saying, ma'am. He's being a little bit more professional, a little bit more formal because he's in a big environment. There's lots of the servants are right there. And he doesn't want to go, mom, right? So he doesn't do that. I had a friend, he was a pastor. He's a pastor up at New Life, and his dad was the lead pastor, and Robert was the campus pastor, the executive pastor. And we would get in a room, and sometimes, we're determining, the direction of the church, or how we're going to do this, or how we're going to, this next vision piece, or how we're going to fund this, and, kind of working big blue arrow type stuff. We're talking about it. And when we're in those rooms, and even when he would be on stage preaching, he would try to avoid looking at him and going, Dad. He would call him Pastor Mike. And he would do that out of respect to him, for one, but also just out of like, hey, this is not the environment for you to be dad for me. Right? For him, he's like, that's a little bit more like Pastor Mike. And he did that on his own accord. Pastor Mike didn't request that at all, because I think it's pretty honoring to be called dad. I think that's pretty awesome. But, he just wanted to be a little bit more professional. That's what Jesus is doing here. He's a little bit more official, a little bit more formal, a little bit more professional, a little bit more like, ma'am, my lady. It's a sign of respect. Why do you involve me? This isn't my problem. Mom, you signed up for the party planning committee. If you notice, I've been absent at those meetings. I'm not interested in doing that. You said you were going to do this. I'm not involved. Why do you involve me? And then he goes on, he says, my hour's not yet come, meaning I know what you're trying to do. You want me to do a miracle, Mom, and I'm not ready for it. I don't want to do that yet, okay? It's not my time. My hour has not yet come. Come on, Mom, you could fix it. Like, come on, there's people down the road. Go check with the Jones. The Jones have wine. Believe me, I see Ms. Jones. They got a lot of wine, Mom. Go ask them. We're not, like, come on, don't involve me. It's not my time. And I love what she does next, because it's a mom move. Oh, it's a mom move. It is the best mom move. Jesus sits there and says, well, Mom, come on, my lady, why do you involve me? And then she looks, and I think she smiles. And in my head, Jesus is taller than Mary. Mary's short. And I think she looks up at him, and she smiles at her son. And then looks over to the servants. You just do whatever he says. And then I think she walks away, because we don't hear about her again. I think she looks and she goes, they're running out of wine. And Jesus is like, not my problem. And she goes, you do whatever he says. And then she just mommed Jesus. Like, that's what happened. Which nobody gets to do that except Mary, the mother of Jesus. So that's what I think happened. And I think she walks away, and now she tells the servants, do whatever he tells you. And I think she's looking over her shoulder, thinking like, he's got it, right? So Mom knows best, right? And now Jesus hadn't done any miracles really publicly yet. He hadn't proclaimed himself as anything just yet. Remember, the miracle he did with Peter and all them was in the boat, and then they brought it ashore. And if you remember, he kind of gave credit to Peter and the team. Like, he really didn't say, I did it. So there's this weird thing where Jesus just wasn't ready to come out about his deity yet. And he wasn't ready to come out about who he was and his Messiah just yet. But I've noticed something. Did you notice Mary knew that he could do something? Which makes me believe, and I think is a reasonable belief, that Jesus had been doing miracles at home. How else would she know that he could fix this problem? Like, she literally looks at him and goes, honey, they're out of wine. Looks at the servants, do whatever he says. She knows it. She's seen something. We have no idea what it is. Now, I think she probably didn't go to the grocery store in like 10 years, right? I imagine she did in the same voice that she found him, where she's like, honey, we're out of wine. I think she came to him when he was little and goes, honey, we're out of sugar. And she's like, Mom, I don't want to. Okay. And then boom, sugar in the cabinet. Like, I don't think she did, because something had that. The only thing we know is she was convinced that he could solve this problem. She was convinced, because she tells him and then she walks away. And as she walks away, Jesus, I think, goes, oh, Mom did it again. But she's Mom, so she can do that. And nearby, John tells us, stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. So 6 of these jars, big tall jars, are hanging around. And Jesus looks over, and I think he recognizes something, because those jars were used for ceremonial washing. Those jars were used, they were tied directly to the law as a requirement. And remember, they're having a big party, lots of friends and family coming over. So as lots of friends and family come over, guess what they have to do? Abide by the law. What's the law require? Got to wash our feet, wash our hands. Sometimes we got to wash up to our elbows. Sometimes we have to do multiple washings depending on who we've been around and what we've touched this week. So they have these jars set out that'll do all these washings to make yourself clean and go through all this process again. And Jesus, I think, looks over and goes, I know what I'm going to do. I know how I'm going to make this sign point to something more than my party animal attitude, right? I think that's what he's trying to do. Because remember, signs are meant to direct you. They're meant to direct you. He didn't do this to save the wedding. He did this to point his disciples and the others in the room to who he was. And I love the way that one of the commentators in Erdman's commentary puts it. He says, the old empty symbols of ritual, the jars, the old empty symbols of ritual are changed into abundant sources of celebration. And Jesus told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. Just draw out some water and take these jars to the master of the banquet. To which everybody who's reading this goes, hold on, Jesus. You're just going to give the master of the banquet water. You're just going to give him water. And they did so, John tells us, that the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into grape juice. He did not realize it had come from where it had come from, though the servants who'd drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside, and he says, everyone brings out the choice wine first and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you've saved the best till now. And I think John smiles as he pens those last few words. You saved the best until now. And I think he recognizes as he's telling this story and as he's thought back, I think he writes down, he goes, the kind used for ceremonial wine. Oh, I think we missed it. Like, I bet John, as an old man's writing this and says, you were doing something different. You changed the old into new. And then later you told us that you came to fulfill the law. You came to complete it. You came to sign the bottom of the contract and flip over the page. This is what you came to do. And this was the first sign. This was the first sign of what you were about to do. And I think the light bulb goes off for him when he pens these last few words. So, remember, this wasn't for the entire banquet. Only a few people knew. But it was enough to begin the rumors. It was enough to begin the conversations. And John continues. He said, what Jesus did here in Cana was the first of the signs, not miracles, signs directing us, through which he would be revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. All the signs we're going to study over the next few weeks are going to be pointing to the glory of Christ. And each one is a little bit different, but each one is pointing and directing us to who he is and what he did. And John says, after this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and there he stayed for a few days. So, Jesus turns the water into wine at a party, not because he wanted the attention, not because he wanted to save the wedding, not because of any other reason, I think, except to show everybody that would be present with his disciples and the servants, particularly his disciples. They were there and they saw it. Something new is coming. Something new has happened. The old has passed away. It's been fulfilled. The new is here. The new is here. So here's the moral of the story. Here's the takeaway. Be like Jesus. Do what your mama says. So we're going to say amen, and we're going to close out the service, right? In the first service, I had a couple of the moms lean over and then taking pictures of it. I don't know if they're going to put it on their sons or their daughters. It was good. But Jesus did listen to his mom, just for point of emphasis. He even looked at her and said, my time's not yet come, and she walks away, and he goes, well, now I have to, because mom said it, right? But it wasn't just that. It wasn't just that. In reality, the question that we need to wrestle to the ground is, are you ready to trade out for something new? Because that's what Jesus was pointing to. He shows up and the sign was, hey, those ceremonial jars, those things sitting over there that represent the law, that were a significant part of it, I'm actually going to change those into something entirely new. What was old and dead, ritualistic things that served a purpose, and it had a purpose, and the purpose has been fulfilled. I'm going to fulfill that and give you something new. I'm going to give you something new. And here's the thing. He offers the same thing to us, that we can choose to have something new. And maybe for some of us, we have some old habits, some old things that maybe are part of those old jars. Maybe it's even part of your tradition that you grew up in the church. Maybe you're carrying some of those traditions that are old that maybe they need to be processed. Maybe they need to be evaluated. Maybe they need to be set aside. Maybe there's some habits that you've been making excuses for, some habits that you've been justifying, some behaviors that you've said are okay, and that you look around and tell everybody, it's okay, it's okay. Maybe there's some of those things sitting on the back wall, just like those jars, and maybe it served a purpose at one point in time. But Jesus says, I want to do something new. So over the next few weeks, as we look at these different signs, because remember, these signs are going to be directing us. They're going to be helping us get to this journey and eventually getting us to the end of the story where Christ is crucified. So as we're watching and we're reviewing and we're seeing these signs as they're directing us, the first question I got to ask before we even get there is, are you ready for something new? Because this is new. The signs we're going to talk about and the miracles we're going to talk about over the next few weeks, they're going to challenge us. They're going to challenge us to change behavior. They're going to challenge our prejudice. They're going to challenge the way we think about things. They're going to challenge the way we treat people. It's going to be challenging. So my question is, are you ready for something new? A new faith, a deeper faith, not just empty jars sitting against the wall, that you and I have something new that we can grab a hold of. So, if you're ready, join us over the next few weeks as we journey through the miracles that John records. But don't come if you're not ready for something new, because he's going to take us somewhere we've never been. So, with that, I would love to pray for you. Thank you, Jesus, that you came for something new. Thank you that you showed up and you showed us what it looks like. And thank you for these moments These miracles that we're going to explore that John wrote down so that we could kind of track with where you were going and what you were doing. So as we get ready to do that over the next few weeks, Lord, strip away anything that's unnecessary. Strip away anything that would get in the way. Strip away anything that would prevent us from becoming a new creation, as Paul calls it. Strip away, press against anything that's going to cause us to get in our own way and in the way of the work that you want to do in our life through the message of these miracles. So, Lord, I pray that we would be brave enough to say, I'm ready for something new. I'm ready to try. I'm ready to let go of some of those old things that have been destructive or that have gotten in the way. I'm ready to set aside some of the things that maybe don't quite fit anymore now that I've said I follow Jesus. That I'm ready to resist the temptations that normally I always said yes to. That I'm ready for something new, Lord. And we're ready for something new as your church. So, Heavenly Father, we love you. We give you all the praise. And the church said,